Hello and welcome to another video on machine learning in biotechnology. My name is Ian Hoffecker, and the topic for this video is going to be architectural techniques in neural networks. Specifically, I'm going to talk about convolutional neural networks and why these are a solution to the problem of some limitations of vanilla neural networks or multi-layer perceptron, which have some limitations when it comes to image-like data, images, and data that are similar to images. We're going to use convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, which are kind of a sparse or special case of the classic neural network. And then I'm going to talk a bit about architecture diagrams and, in general, how we tend to think of neural networks in these higher levels of abstraction, and then go over an exercise, which is a spatial biology example, so some image-like data, and then go through some review over all the topics covered in the previous videos and just kind of try to wrap things up and give some perspective. So previously we talked about these multi-layer perceptrons or feed-forward neural networks, and these are kind of the standard or the basic neural network, or vanilla neural networks, as they're called. And a key feature of them was that they have this hierarchical structure that is able to take on the hierarchical structure that's in your data. And this was useful for capturing complex logical interactions between variables that might be hard to detect with linear models, or impossible to detect. For example, in the case of the XOR logic gate, which we showed required at least one hidden layer. And one feature of these vanilla neural networks was that they had a lot of parameters, so they're fully connected, where you had input layers would be connected to all nodes. Each node in the input layer, each variable in the input layer has a connection and set of weights parameters associated with each and every node in the hidden layer, and each node in the hidden layer in turn is connected to each layer in the output, or if there are multiple hidden layers, then you're connecting all of these nodes as well. So in general, lots of parameters and no real distinction between connections other than the values that the weights take on after you train the network. But this can have some disadvantages. The main one is that there are a lot of parameters, which means that this is hard to scale. So if you have an image, for example, a 10 by 10 image, that means you already have 100 nodes or 100 input variables. So we think of each of those pixels being able to take on a value, a brightness. And this is, we can treat this just like a node in a neural network or an input variable. And we can actually use a multi-layer perceptron to process an image or to recognize patterns in an image. So that's what you're looking at here. And the step that you're seeing in the beginning here is the flattening of this image. So the image is originally arrayed in this grid format, where you have a row and column position for each pixel. But the multi-layer perceptron does not pay attention to any of that kind of spatial relationship or relationship between input variables that is kind of present in the architecture of an image itself. So instead, we just flatten it, which means we're removing the structure. We're keeping track of these nodes, but we're not keeping track of their relationship to one another. And we're connecting them through weights and biases to the output information. And we can reassemble the image in the output if we keep track of or remember where these nodes came from. But again, the image is not the information about the relationship between pixels, for example, pixels that are neighbors to one another. This is not being dealt with explicitly in the structure of a multi-layer perceptron. So one thing that can happen is something called translational invariance. So we might have a pattern or feature that we're trying to detect, for example, this plus sign here in the image, and the multi-layer perceptron can indeed detect it. So maybe we would get a strong signal in this middle square here after training the network, and it would recognize that this pattern in this particular node has this signature, and we could detect it. But then we move this plus sign over 1 pixel. So each item in here we move over by 1 pixel. And then we see that actually the pattern disappears in the vanilla neural network. And this is because we would need to retrain the network for this pattern entirely, have a new set of weights that correspond to this pixel or this particular pattern of pixels, whereas we might want a neural network that somehow can deal with this translation, so recognize the same pattern, but just in a different context, a different set of nodes. And so that's what a convolutional neural network will allow us to do. And then it's also going to allow us to take advantage of the spatial structure and the fact that images or image-like data tend to have spatial correlations. So, for example, we have this cluster of points here. They're not scattered randomly, but in fact, if we're, say, looking at this cell, we have a high chance of having an activation when we move to the next cell or the next pixel in this cluster here. So local correlations are important. And when you remove this spatial context, flattening the network, flattening the matrix to send it through a classic neural network, we're kind of missing out on all of this information that you get from local structure. So convolutional neural networks deal with this problem by explicitly imposing this local structure, the architecture of the neural network. So if we look at a 1D example, a convolutional neural network in 1D is going to take an input, which is going to be a one-dimensional vector like this. So we can think of these as different input variables with different values. And what we're going to do is apply a kernel or a filter. So this is a sliding window with values in it that we're going to multiply and sum with the input values at each of the possible positions that we could slide this kernel or this filter along. And then the output is going to take on the values of those sum products in each of the sliding window positions, or each of the positions that we can place this kernel. So we can think of this also algebraically. So here it is kind of written out. So we have W, or the weight vector, convoluted with X, the input vector, is going to be equal to this summation of products here. So you can see that each term is a product between a weight and a input value here. And the index here on the weights is indicating the position in the kernel. So this minus L here refers to the coordinate inside the kernel. So we think of the middle pixel of the kernel as 0, and W sub -1 would be 1 pixel to the left, and W sub +1 would be 1 pixel to the right. So we can think of this kernel as having its own kind of coordinate system, and then the input vector is also going to have its own coordinate system. So we want to sum all of the weights with their corresponding inputs for each position. And so we can write out this summation like this. So all of the positions in the X input here with U, and we're going to sum all of these products. So this is a kind of dot product. And this is referred to as convolution in the context of neural networks or machine learning. But in mathematics, this is typically referred to as cross-correlation. And convolution has its own definition in which you typically flip the kernel backwards or reverse the order of the kernel. But what we're doing is not flipping it, and we're computing actually the cross-correlation, which is the machine learning convolution. And so that's for one-dimensional inputs. And for two-dimensional, we have a similar setup here, except that we add an additional direction to scan this filter or kernel in. So instead of a single summation over all positions in the one-dimensional vector, we have a double summation here where we're sliding the window from left to right and also from top to bottom. So we want all combinations of where we can place this kernel in our input matrix in this case. And it's going to work the same way. So we would say multiply 0 and 0 here, 1 and 1 here, 2 and 3 here, and 3 and 4 here, and sum those results to populate one cell of our output matrix here. And so that's going to be, again, the kernel or the weight matrix convoluted with the input data. And so again, so the kernel is going to have these values. And the idea is that our neural network is going to determine those values, which best allow us to predict the output on the basis of our training data. So the weights or the values in this kernel are going to be determined by backpropagation. So these are weights that are going to be reused multiple times. So you can think of, if we're thinking in terms of a multi-layer perceptron, imagine reusing these weights and also applying edges between an input layer, an input vector, and a hidden layer somewhat sparsely. So instead of fully connected, we have these limited combinations of positions where we're connecting these input nodes here to the kernel and applying these specific set of weights here. And so for some intuition, we can think of this kernel activation output generation here as a kind of template matching. So we're interested in finding places where the kernel looks like the input. So we're going to get a large value in the output if, say, there's a lot of overlap between the kernel and a particular position in the input. So if for example, we have large values in the kernel on the diagonal here and large values on the diagonal on the input in this particular position, then that's going to strongly activate our output. So the shape of the kernel becomes this kind of feature detector. And so you can see after training a neural network or a convolutional neural network, we get this set of kernels whose weights have been tuned to search for certain features, small image motifs, such as edges or textures, certain patterns that we're looking for in the image that are going to recur in multiple locations. So a vertical edge, for example, might occur in multiple places. And then our output, after scanning with that particular kernel, is going to light up in places where there is a vertical edge. And so again, we can kind of go back to the original kind of conceptual model of a neural network that we were using for the multi-layer perceptron, but apply the convolutional neural network architecture to it. We started with this kind of scanning filter analogy, but how does this look? So we have this output layer, right, that has 4 nodes in this case, right? There's 4 positions where we can place our filter or our kernel. So we're going to have 4 outputs of those dot products, each of those dot products. So that means if we're rigging up one of these graph diagrams here, we will have 4 nodes on this hidden layer, and then connect them not to every single input as we would in a multi-layer perceptron or a vanilla network, but instead we're only going to connect them to the positions that those kernel, that the sliding window position corresponds to. So in the first one, W1 is connected to X1, W2 connected to X2, W3 connected to X4, W4 connected to X5, like this. So that's this first set of 4 connections here. And we have weight 1, weight 2, weight 3, weight 4 here. And these are also going to occur 4 times each. So we have weight 1 occurring 4 times for each of the 4 positions. So you can see that we've saved some space. So we have fewer parameters than we would have in the corresponding classical neural network. We also have fewer connections. So we're reusing weights and we're not connecting everything to everything in this case. And in that way, we simplify the computational problem of determining the weights. And so if we were to look at, say, like how to make one of these layers in Keras or TensorFlow, we're specifying the number of kernels, so 45 in this case, and the dimensions of that kernel. So this is a 3x3 kernel. We can also deal with colors. So if we have, say, an RGB image, then basically we have 2 or 3 matrices, each corresponding to the color channel. So the red matrix, the green matrix, or the blue matrix. And so we can deal with this in a convolutional neural network simply by adding this additional dimension to our summation, to our sum product or dot product here. So it becomes a triple summation now. So we have these kernels being applied to the separate kernels now, one for each channel, and being applied to each of the sliding window positions in our input, and computing a combined product or summation for the output. And this output is called the feature map because it's becoming a map of where these features are located. So the kernel is kind of this feature detector, and then the output after scanning our input is this map of where these features are. A common technique that is going to emerge is something called pooling. So this is a way to simplify and kind of extract information from a convolutional neural network. So in some cases, you may be in a situation where, so we said that the feature map is going to tell you where these features are. Maybe we're interested not in where they are, but in whether or not they're there at all. So maybe we have a line detector, and we want to know, are there any vertical lines, let's say, in our image? And we don't care so much about where they are. We just want to know, do they exist? And so pooling is going to help with that, kind of simplify things. So the idea is that we're reducing the dimension. So a 2x2 max pooling is going to take the maximum value in a 2x2 matrix here. And then the output is then just going to correspond to the maximum value. And so this can help to kind of amplify some of the features and reduce some of the noise in some of these image processing tasks. Another interesting concept is the idea of graph convolutional neural networks. So we can think of these as a generalization of convolutional neural networks, in which we think of the convolution function as not this fixed grid concept, but as a graph-based process. So we can draw actually our kernel not as this, say, 3x3 matrix, but instead as this node, the central node connected to neighboring nodes. And we can think of an image as a collection of these locally connected nodes. And then the sliding window effect would be act of checking different nodes and examining their nearest neighbors or next nearest neighbors. And so we could apply this to graphs with non-lattice or non-grid-like structures as well, and apply a similar concept. So we could examine each node and its neighbors and imply a similar kind of operation that we might in computing or creating a convolutional layer in our neural network, where we have this input, and then we're looking at a specific topology or a specific set of connections and applying weights to those connections to produce some output value. And maybe there's 5 connections or 6 connections, and that there's some variation in there, and it isn't just this easy graph structure here. So this is convolutional neural networks, and one of the things that we're going to run into increasingly in this field is thinking in terms of higher levels of abstraction. So it's good for us to be able to picture what's going on at the microscopic level, so understand how nodes are wired to other nodes on an individual basis. But then increasingly we're talking about multiple layers and multiple parallel layers in the case of convolutional neural networks, where we have these different positions. And so it helps to be able to coarse grain everything and start thinking in terms of a higher level of abstraction. So here we have a convolutional neural network for recognizing handwritten digits. So we have the input illustrated here, and we see how a patch, a 2x2 patch here, ends up being processed in a convolutional layer. So this convolutional layer has 6 kernels. So we see the 6 squares here. Each of them are 5x5 pixels, and this is going to generate for us 6 outputs or 6 feature maps, maps of where these kernel features are occurring in the original image. And those feature maps, in this case, are going to have the same dimensions as the original image. So we're going to produce 6 28x28 feature maps. And then in this particular architecture, there's a pooling step. So the 28x28 matrices are reduced to these 14x14 smaller matrices, taking the max values at these different 2x2 positions, reducing them to a 1x1 pixel in each case. And then we have another convolutional layer here. So we're adding additional depth to this neural network. And again, depth is being used to capture hierarchical relationships in the data. And this is the key for capturing these nonlinearities in general in these kind of complex data sets, such as handwritten numbers. And so in this layer, we have 16 different kernels, each of them 5x5. We have another pooling layer. And then at the end, we have a series of classical dense layers. So multi-layer perceptron-like layers here where everything is connected. And then in the last final output layer, we have 10 sigmoids here that represent the activation for the numbers, the digits 0 to 9. So we're looking for an output on, say, the 7th node for this particular input here, since we have the number 7. And so you'll see these architectural diagrams used to describe at a very high level what's going on in some of the increasingly more complex neural networks. So for example, this is a image captioning neural network, which takes as its input an image, runs it through a convolutional neural network to recognize the features in this image, but then is sending this to a recurrent neural network that's going to be used to handle sequence data and finally output a sequence of text, so an image caption that is associated with this input image here. Here's another architecture. So we have an RGB image being fed in as the input, and then the output is another image that has the same size dimensions as this RGB image, except its content here are segments or class labels on parts of the image. So the image has been divided into components like the road or the sidewalk, the cars here. So this particular architecture, this is called an encoder-decoder. The idea here is that we're starting with the input and increasingly identifying structures and simplifying using pooling to reduce the dimensions and kind of simplify and reduce some of the complexity that's in this image, and then expand and blow that back up again so that we end up with the final same dimensions as the input image, but now with this structure imparted on it. And so we can talk a bit about how to do this also in practice. So here's R code and Python code for building architectures, and it's useful to talk about this functional paradigm in Keras or TensorFlow, where we can create an output in one step of our neural network and feed that in as the input to the next step. So here we have the input matrix as the starting point of this neural network, and then that is being fed in here as the input parameter here to the next layer, a dense layer with 3 nodes, and this is being assigned to the variable x. And then you'll see that in the next step here, we have an output being generated with the input parameter x, so the result of the previous layer. And we're doing the same operation here in the R code using this pipe operation, percent greater than and percent sign here. So the first layer is being piped into the second layer, and then the second layer is being piped into the final layer here. And you can do this multiple times. So we can create a whole sequence of these actions here. So on the Python side here, we see x being reassigned multiple times, and in each case, x being fed in as an input to the next layer. And so in this way, we generate this sequence of processing steps. And again, we have this here also with piping in the case of the R code. So for this exercise, collab exercise, we have a spatial biology problem. So we're going to make a kind of encoder-decoder, like the architecture I mentioned, the segmentation code. So in this case, what we're trying to do is detect cancer in this, say, simulated tissue slice. So the information that we have at our hands is a set of cells, each with 6 genes and their expression values. So the genes can either be in the on or off position. and there are 6 of them. So here I'm using RGB colors to kind of illustrate this for the first 3 of these 6 genes, but then there are 3 more that we're not seeing here. And the goal here is to detect this cancer structure here on the basis of this data. So we have a kind of answer key that we're going to use for our training data, which is the class label here. And then we want to get the model to figure out these relationships. So you can see that a linear model is probably going to have trouble already. So yeah, maybe there's a kind of pattern here. You can see there's a lot of black squares here close to the cancer, but there's black squares elsewhere as well. And it's not all black squares either. So we have, you can see that maybe towards the edge here, there are some of these squares are colored. So there's clearly a complex relationship between these genes and the cancer status. And furthermore, there's spatial correlations. So a vanilla multi-layer perceptron is in particular going to have trouble with this. So while we have, with our vision, the benefit of recognizing that, yeah, there's kind of a blob here that maybe looks different from the other pixels, a multi-layer perceptron is just going to see, yeah, there's black squares, but it cannot distinguish them from these other black squares or hexagons. So we want to take advantage of this spatial correlation. So that's convolutional neural networks. And then now I'm just going to reflect a bit on everything we've covered so far in these previous lectures. And we kind of started with probability theory, generating data using Monte Carlo method. And this was an interesting exercise to teach us what data actually is and what probability actually is. So why do probability distributions have the shape that they do? And we discussed how this is the result of events mapping to numbers and events mapping to similar numbers, or similar events mapping to the same numbers. And this is what's going to give you a higher bar or a lower bar in a probability distribution. And we have these functions that can be used to predict and describe this mapping of events to numbers. And these are probability functions, probability density functions, or probability mass functions. And these are going to give us a formula with parameters that allow us to predict how numbers are going to map, events are going to map. And these parameters are allowing us to, with very systematic manipulation, determine what probability generating process is underlying data that we see. So we've talked about the likelihood formulation of a probability distribution or a data analysis problem, where we're asking the question, what is the probability that we observe some data X given a set of parameters? And we have some probability function that we're using that has a certain set of parameters and will give us this probability of seeing, say, a particular data point given those parameters. And so if we manipulate those parameters systematically, change them, tweak them, we can see that we'll have higher or lower values of this likelihood expression, or higher or lower values of the probability of seeing a particular data point or a particular collection of data points for those given parameter values. And this then becomes the basis for parameterization, or determining of optimal parameters. So we manipulate these parameters, and then we're interested in finding the maximum value of this likelihood function. So this was the maximum likelihood estimation method. And the way we went about this was by converting this likelihood expression into a loss function or a penalty function. So in many cases, this was the negative log likelihood, which we were trying to minimize for various problems. And that took the form of the binary cross entropy, for example, in the case of binary classification problems. But then this could have other values, again, derived from this probability expression and the particular probability distribution that we are looking at. And so this becomes kind of a recurring theme in machine learning. So we're trying to minimize this loss function. And we do this using gradient descent, or basically taking a small step in parameter space and seeing or checking how much this affects the value of our cost function or loss function. And so we can navigate parameter space by making small steps and seeing that we're consistently reducing the value of our loss function, or in other words, maximizing the likelihood of our data given the parameters that we've chosen or the particular position we happen to be in parameter space. And so for some problems, it was possible to compute a gradient analytically, and we could navigate this space using a learning rate. So this was a step size that we would multiply with this gradient to either more quickly or more slowly approach a minimum in that space. And so these techniques for choosing parameters, we can apply them to perform machine learning tasks. And so the basic building blocks in machine learning that we looked at were linear regression, logistic regression, and we could see how these were actually kind of small mini components of neural networks. So in the case of linear regression, we could draw this diagram where we have input variables connected to some sort of output by weights and a bias, and we're summing up the contributions of each of those inputs multiplied with each of their weights and getting this linear combination of features, we called it, as our output. In the case of logistic regression, it's the same thing, except at the end, we're also processing that linear combination of features through a sigmoidal activation function. And that was going to give us a number from 0 to 1, or a mapping of this linear combination of features to a probability. And we could use that to classify things 1 or 0 on the basis of this linear model here. And so the logistic regression, it turned out, was very similar to the single layer perceptron or the basic vanilla neural network. And we could even draw out the kind of neural network diagram. We have the weights colored with the darkness of the lines here, and we can see that different input values here are very analogous to the input activation levels on the dendrites of a neuron. And so those are the kind of basic building blocks. And then we could go further and add depth to these models by creating additional layers, or treating logistic regression or linear regression as modules that we could connect together like Lego bricks and create higher order structures. And these higher order structures allow us in turn to capture higher order relationships in the data itself. So we looked at how we could detect the XOR logic gate using a multi-layer perceptron with at least one hidden layer, a couple hidden nodes. And this was impossible to do with a classic logistic regression. And why is that the case? Well, it turns out it's built on these even more fundamental logic gates, the AND, the OR, and the NOT gate. And we saw those emerging as the intermediate outputs in this hidden layer. And so the final output required this level of abstraction to process the input data. So we need to first compute AND and OR operations in order to compute the XOR operation. And this structure, which was inherent in the data and not explicitly given or decided that we would impose this on the neural network, the training itself, the act of backpropagation to adjust the weights and the biases, discovered this structure. And so that's sort of the magic and the power of neural networks, that they're able to capture this complexity and capture this structure in the data. And this kind of hierarchical aspect is key and a repeating fundamental feature of machine learning in general. So when we look at modern machine learning algorithms, things like AlphaFold here, or transformer networks like those underlying things like ChatGPT or image generation AI, we have this very high level of abstraction. So kind of thinking at a very coarse granularity of large components that have maybe many smaller subcomponents. And that's because we're increasingly dealing with modules of modules of modules, and we have this hierarchy of components and their subcomponents. And that's really what we're after when we're trying to analyze complex data. So complex data is going to have this hierarchical structure in it to begin with, and what we want to do is discover it and organize it and find out what that structure is ourselves. And so this is the last in this video, or last in the series of this videos. And I just want to mention, give credit to the text that we've been using, which is this book, Probabilistic Machine Learning by Kevin Murphy. And what I've done is try to stick very closely to the nomenclature and conventions of this book in order to give you a basis to explore the content further. So there are, of course, many topics that we didn't cover, such as, for example, the attention mechanism or transformers, graph neural networks, a lot of interesting topics that are covered in this book and his more advanced book. And it's a very technical book, so it uses technical language and it's based on probability theory. But hopefully this kind of foundation of maximum likelihood estimation, parameter estimation that we've gone through, exploration of these equations and formula, hopefully give you the basis for understanding and being able to go further in this field. So that's it for this series of videos. Thank you and good luck.